There are certain summers you don't recognize as the last of anything while you're actually living through them. You only understand it years later, looking back, realizing that was the last summer the swimming pool at the park was the entire neighborhood's social calendar. That was the last summer 3 television networks were simply all there was, and every single person you knew had watched the exact same thing the night before. The summer of 1980 was one of those summers for an enormous number of American families. Not because 1980 itself was special, but because it sat in that narrow, strange window where the America of the 50s and 60s was still fully recognizable, and the America we actually live in now had already, quietly, begun. I want to spend today inside that specific summer, because I don't think most of us realize just how much was still exactly the way it had always been in June of 1980, and just how much had permanently, irreversibly changed by the time autumn arrived. This isn't a story about one single dramatic event. It's a story about an entire country standing at a hinge point without fully realizing it, still living one kind of life, while a different one was already being built just a few months ahead. Let's set the scene properly, because the texture of daily life in 1980 matters just as much as any single headline from that year. In 1980, the United States had roughly 226 million people, and the vast majority of American households still got their news and entertainment from exactly 3 television networks: ABC, NBC, and CBS, plus whatever independent local stations their antenna could pull in. There was no 4th major network yet. There was no cable news. If you wanted to know what happened in the world that day, you watched the same half-hour broadcast at the same time on largely the same 3 choices as almost everyone else in the country. Walter Cronkite was still anchoring the CBS Evening News, a voice so trusted that surveys had repeatedly named him the most trusted man in America, a phrase that feels almost impossible to imagine attaching to any single news figure today. Jimmy Carter was in the White House in the final year of a presidency increasingly defined by 2 things hanging over that entire summer: American hostages still held in Iran, now approaching a year in captivity, and gas lines that, while somewhat eased from their worst point a couple of years earlier, had left a lingering, uneasy sense that the confident post-war American economy of earlier decades wasn't quite as unshakable as it had once seemed. Inflation that summer was running above 13% annually, a number that, if you're used to modern inflation figures, is genuinely difficult to picture. An economy where prices were visibly, noticeably climbing month over month in a way people actually felt at the grocery store and the gas pump. And yet, for a huge number of American families, none of that national anxiety fully broke into the rhythm of an ordinary summer. Kids were still out the door after breakfast and not expected back until dinner, roaming a neighborhood on bikes with genuinely minimal supervision by today's standards. The municipal pool, if the town had one, functioned as something close to the entire neighborhood's social hub for 3 straight months. Drive-in movie theaters, though already declining sharply from their peak, were still very much a real Friday night option in a huge number of towns. It was, in the texture of daily life, still remarkably close to the America of a generation earlier. If walking through a specific year like this, the ordinary alongside the historic, is something you enjoy, go ahead and subscribe to Back Home in America now, because that's exactly the kind of history we dig into every single week. Let's talk about what a genuinely ordinary week looked like for an American family that summer, because I think the specific details tell you more than any statistic could. Dinner, in a huge number of households, was still built around whatever the family had grown up eating: meatloaf, casseroles, a roast on Sunday, though the frozen TV dinner and the drive-through hamburger were both by now firmly, comfortably established parts of American life, rather than novelties. McDonald's had crossed 6,000 locations worldwide by this point, and a trip there was still, for a lot of families, a genuine treat, rather than the routine, almost daily option it would become for later generations. Music that summer came overwhelmingly from the radio, and from vinyl records, since the cassette tape, while increasingly common, hadn't yet displaced the record player as the dominant way most households actually listened to music at home. And the compact disc didn't exist commercially at all yet. If your family had a home stereo, it likely had a turntable built directly into a wooden cabinet console, a piece of furniture as much as a piece of technology, sitting in the living room the way the tube television we've discussed on this channel before once did. Communication with anyone outside your own house still ran almost entirely through a telephone, physically attached to a wall or a desk by a cord. And reaching someone who wasn't home when you called simply meant you didn't reach them, full stop, until you tried again later, or they happened to call you back. There was no voicemail in most households yet, no answering machine in the majority of homes, no way to leave a message beyond asking whoever picked up to pass it along. A missed call in 1980 was, in the most literal sense, simply missed. Let's talk about what people were actually watching and listening to that summer, because entertainment in 1980 still moved through a remarkably small number of channels compared to what came only a few years later. At the movie theater, The Empire Strikes Back had opened that May and was, by summer, the film practically everyone under 30 had either already seen or was being relentlessly encouraged by friends to go see immediately, frequently more than once, since there was no home video rental yet in most towns to simply wait for. Going to the movies in 1980 was still overwhelmingly a single screen, or at best, a handful of screens under one roof experience. Nothing like the 12 and 16 screen multiplexes that would spread rapidly through the following decade. If your town had a drive-in, and a genuinely large number of American towns still did that summer, even as the format's national numbers had already fallen substantially from their 1950s and 60s peak, a warm evening might still mean piling the family into the station wagon, kids in pajamas in the back seat, for a double feature under the stars. Top 40 radio that summer was dominated by a mix that, looking back, captures the exact transitional moment we're describing better than almost anything else. Disco, though already being declared dead by plenty of critics after its enormous late 70s peak, was still very much on the airwaves, while a new, sharper new wave sound coming out of both Britain and American cities was starting to work its way onto the same stations, standing right alongside the soft rock and singer-songwriter ballads that had dominated the previous several years. If you were a teenager with a transistor radio or a car with an AM/FM dial that summer, you were hearing, often within the same 15 minutes, sounds that belonged to at least 3 distinctly different musical eras, all still overlapping on the same station at once. There's a third thread running through that exact same summer that I think deserves its own space, because it shows just how directly the biggest geopolitical tensions of the era reached all the way down into something as ordinary as a kid's bedroom poster of their favorite athlete. In the summer of 1980, the Summer Olympics were held in Moscow. In the United States, along with roughly 60 other countries, boycotted them entirely in protest of the Soviet Union's invasion of Afghanistan the previous winter. For a huge number of American athletes who had spent years, in some cases their entire young adult lives, training specifically for that one summer, the decision meant an Olympic dream simply evaporated, with no do-over available, since the next Summer Games were 4 full years away. President Carter had announced the boycott back in the spring, tying it directly to broader Cold War tensions that had been quietly, steadily rising throughout the second half of the 1970s. For ordinary American families that summer, the boycott meant something smaller, but still genuinely felt: the absence of the specific kind of shared national ritual the Olympics normally provided. Gathering around the television every 4 years to watch athletes representing the whole country. A moment of unified attention, not unlike the nightly news broadcast we talked about earlier, just occurring once every 4 years instead of every evening. Its absence in 1980 was a quiet reminder, arriving in the middle of an otherwise ordinary summer, that the wider Cold War tensions shaping the decade weren't confined to news broadcasts and diplomatic cables. They reached all the way down into which events American families would or wouldn't be gathering around their television to watch that August. Now here's where the summer of 1980 stops being simply another ordinary year and starts becoming the specific hinge point I want to focus on today. Because two things happened within just a few months of each other that, together, quietly marked the actual boundary between one version of America and the next. On June 1st, 1980, a relatively small, oddly ambitious cable channel launched out of a converted country club building in Atlanta, Georgia. It was called Cable News Network, and almost nobody at the time, including a fair number of people inside the television industry itself, thought the idea of a channel broadcasting nothing but news, 24 hours a day, every single day, could possibly work. Existing networks had spent decades operating on the assumption that people wanted their news delivered in a tight, edited half-hour each evening, not sprawled across an entire day. CNN's early broadcasts were famously scrappy, understaffed, and occasionally chaotic, and the channel spent its first several years as something closer to a curiosity than a serious competitor to the three major networks. But the idea underneath CNN, that news could exist continuously rather than as a scheduled evening event, that you didn't have to wait until 6 o'clock to find out what had happened in the world that day, was the first real crack in the specific kind of shared, synchronized national experience we talked about a moment ago. The exact experience where nearly everyone watched the same broadcast at the same time and could talk about it with a neighbor the next morning, knowing they'd seen the same thing. It would take years for that crack to widen into anything most people actually noticed. But it opened, specifically, in the same summer we're talking about today. There's a third thread running through that exact same summer that I think deserves its own space, because it shows just how directly the biggest geopolitical tensions of the era reached all the way down into something as ordinary as a kid's bedroom poster of their favorite athlete. In the summer of 1980, the Summer Olympics were held in Moscow, and the United States, along with roughly 60 other countries, boycotted them entirely in protest of the Soviet Union's invasion of Afghanistan the previous winter. For a huge number of American athletes who had spent years, in some cases their entire young adult lives, training specifically for that one summer, the decision meant an Olympic dream simply evaporated, with no do-over available, since the next Summer Games were 4 full years away. President Carter had announced the boycott back in the spring, tying it directly to broader Cold War tensions that had been quietly, steadily rising throughout the second half of the 1970s. For ordinary American families that summer, the boycott meant something smaller, but still genuinely felt: the absence of the specific kind of shared national ritual the Olympics normally provided. Gathering around the television every 4 years to watch athletes representing the whole country. A moment of unified attention, not unlike the nightly news broadcast we talked about earlier, just occurring once every 4 years instead of every evening. Its absence in 1980 was a quiet reminder, arriving in the middle of an otherwise ordinary summer, that the wider Cold War tensions shaping the decade weren't confined to news broadcasts and diplomatic cables. They reached all the way down into which events American families would or wouldn't be gathering around their television to watch that August. The second hinge came a few months later, in November of 1980, when Ronald Reagan defeated incumbent President Jimmy Carter in a landslide, winning 44 states and ending, decisively, the political era that had defined the previous several years. I want to be careful here, the way we try to be careful on this channel whenever a story brushes up against something political, because this isn't a video about whether that election was good or bad for the country. It's a video about what that specific moment represented structurally, regardless of where anyone personally stood on it. An enormous number of Americans experienced that November as a genuine, felt turning point. A sense, whether they welcomed it or dreaded it, that the country was about to move in a meaningfully different direction than it had been moving in throughout the 1970s. Reagan's own rhetoric explicitly promised a kind of return to an earlier American self-confidence, while at the exact same time, the economic and cultural policies that would actually define the following decade, deregulation, a dramatically different relationship between government and business, a new emphasis on individual achievement and visible consumer prosperity, were about to reshape daily American life in ways that the quiet, community-centered small towns we've discussed elsewhere on this channel would feel very directly over the following years. So, within one single summer and the months immediately surrounding it, the country watched its shared, synchronized information system take its first real crack, and it chose a fundamentally different direction for the decade about to begin. Neither of these things, on the day they happened, felt to most people like the enormous turning point they'd eventually turn out to be. CNN was a niche curiosity. An election was simply an election, one of many. But 1980 is where you can point with real precision to the exact moment both of these particular threads started pulling the country toward the very different place it would be by the end of the decade. We're getting into the part of this story I find genuinely fascinating. And if any of this is resonating with you, a like on this video helps it reach more people who'd enjoy this kind of honest look back at a single, specific year. I want to spend a moment on something that happened just barely outside our specific 1980 window, because understanding it helps explain exactly what made that particular summer the last of its kind. In August of 1981, MTV launched, and within just a few years, fundamentally rewired how an entire generation of American teenagers experienced music, turning it from something you primarily heard into something you primarily watched, curated by a network rather than discovered through a record store clerk's recommendation or a late-night radio DJ's personal taste. That single channel didn't exist yet in the summer we're discussing, but the cable infrastructure that would carry it and the deregulation that would let dozens of specialized channels bloom across it throughout the decade were already being built out, quietly, underneath the ordinary rhythm of that same 1980s summer. By the end of the decade, roughly 60% of American households would subscribe to cable television, up from a small fraction at the decade's start, and the number of channels available to the average household would roughly triple. The shared, synchronized national broadcast we described earlier, the one where nearly the whole country watched the same three networks at the same time, would be permanently, irreversibly fragmented into dozens and eventually hundreds of separate audiences, each watching something different at a different time, talking about something different the next morning, if they talked about it with a neighbor at all. I want to be honest about something here, because I don't think this channel does anyone any favors by treating 1980 as simply a lost golden summer we should mourn without complication. The shared, synchronized culture we're describing, three networks, one evening news broadcast trusted by nearly everyone, came with a genuinely narrower range of perspectives represented on air than what followed. A huge number of American voices, stories, and communities were simply underserved or absent entirely from that shared broadcast. And the fragmentation that cable, and decades later the internet eventually enabled, also opened space for perspectives that three networks, controlled by a fairly narrow set of decision-makers, had never made much room for. The economic anxiety hanging over that summer, the inflation, the gas lines, the hostages still held abroad, was also genuinely difficult for millions of families in ways that nostalgia can too easily smooth over if we're not careful. So I don't think the honest takeaway from this particular summer is that everything about to change was a loss, or that everything about to arrive was automatically worse. Some of what fragmented in the following decade needed to fragment. Some of what got added, more voices, more choices, more ways to find the specific thing you were actually looking for, made things measurably better for a lot of people who'd been poorly served by the narrower system before it. What I keep coming back to is something narrower and more specific than a verdict on whether 1980 was better or worse than what followed. It's simply this. An enormous number of American families spent that particular summer doing genuinely ordinary things, sitting around a wood cabinet television watching one of 3 channels, eating dinner together because there wasn't yet a personal screen at the table competing for anyone's attention, calling a friend on a phone attached to the kitchen wall, and simply accepting it when nobody answered, with absolutely no sense that the specific texture of that ordinary life was about to become something people would eventually look back on as a distinct, closed chapter. Nobody standing in line at a gas station that summer. Nobody watching Walter Cronkite deliver the evening news. Nobody flipping through a stack of vinyl records in their living room thought of themselves as living through the last version of something. They were just living through an ordinary, occasionally difficult, occasionally wonderful summer, the way people always do, without the benefit of knowing which ordinary moments eventually become the ones you can point back to and say, that's when it was still like that, right before it wasn't anymore. If you remember the summer of 1980, or if your parents have ever described it to you, the 3 channels, the record player in the living room, the phone on the kitchen wall, I would genuinely love to hear what that particular year actually looked like from where you were standing. These personal details are exactly what turn a broad historical moment into something real, and I read every story shared here. If this kind of honest, specific look at a single pivotal year in American life is something you'd like more of, go ahead and subscribe to Back Home in America. There's a lot more of this country's history still waiting to be walked through, one ordinary, unrepeatable summer at a time. Thank you for spending this time with me today. Take care of yourselves, and I'll see you in the next one.